Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Eric the Old Jarhead here, and I wanted to talk about a subject today that I see fairly often on social media. Should I buy a sawmill? Or is it worth buying a sawmill? Or was it worth buying a sawmill? You get the idea. You know, when I bought mine back in the end of 2010, early 2011, and I don't remember the actual date I bought it, but I remember I ordered it and it took like a month or less to get it. It didn't take very long to get it back in those days. Same as when I bought my LT40 back in 2016. You know, you buy it, you order it, you get it in a month or less. But you know, that question comes up. Is it worth buying a sawmill? And I'm going to tell you that it's worth it or it's not. So let me clarify that. When I bought my LT10 back in 2011, it was going to cost me around $5,000 to do the knotty pine paneling inside of our off-grid cabin that we're building in the woods. And I had been playing with a Gramberg small chainsaw mill setup with a little 52cc Husqvarna 455 Rancher, which is sitting right there. Still works fine. But anyway, I digress a little bit. Squirrel. In any case, it was going to cost around $5,000. And I bought my LT10 with like 10 bands for about 3,500 bucks. So you can do the math. It's pretty simple, 3,500 versus $5,000. But let's not forget, I had to put a lot of time in, not just getting the mill set up, but, you know, felling trees, bucking them into logs, delimbing, getting rid of all the limbs and all the slash, and then rolling them up to the sawmill, and then milling them, which of course you have to learn. There's a little bit of a learning curve there. And then stacking and stickering the lumber, waiting for it to dry, and then of course I had to have a planer, which that cost me about 200 bucks. And then I had to plane all those boards once they were dry. Then I had to turn them into tongue and groove, which I spent 50 bucks on a plunge router, bought a set of tongue and groove bits, and away I went. Now, I guess if you do that math, 200, 250 plus another 50 for bits maybe, so $300 for the router, the planer, and the bits, 3,500 for the sawmill and bands, around there anyway. You know, you're at 3,800, let's call it close to $4,000 by the time everything is said and done. That's a hell of a deal when you're still looking at $5,000 to buy it. But here's the kicker. This is perhaps the thing that makes the determining factor between whether it's worth buying a sawmill or not. Now, number one, I could have stopped right there and sold the sawmill. And if you know anything about portable sawmills today, they sell for pretty much what you pay for them. I don't know about today because things are a bit crazy, but honestly, typically, you know, if you bought a sawmill for 3,500 bucks, 10 years later, you could sell that sawmill for 3,500 bucks. You know, even 5 or 6 years. Probably the same today. Now, I do see some guys out there with LT10s. You know, they say, can I sell my LT10, you know, $4,000 or whatever? And I tell them, I don't know, maybe not. Because an LX25 at Woodmizer with 10 bands is $4,600. So, and they have sales all the time. So why buy a used LT10 when you can buy the next generation, which is the LT25, for about the same price? Okay? But you could sell, if you bought that LT10 for $3,000 or 3,500 bucks, you probably could sell it for that. I certainly did at one point. I sold mine for what I paid for it. So I even sold the trailer I built under it with it for what I paid for the trailer. And I milled a lot of lumber, and that's kind of the difference. If you're somebody who's looking for that one-time use, I'm gonna get some logs, mill some lumber, and be done with it, and I'm not doing it again, well then a sawmill's probably not worth it for you. It's probably more hassle and time and energy than it's worth. Honestly, I'm just being honest here. On the other hand, if you're like me, and most sawyers I know, if not every single one of them, one of two things can happen. If you've got that little LX25 or LX55, maybe an older LT10 or the current LT15, you probably aren't just doing it for that one job. I mean, I didn't know better at the time, so if you're wondering, I'll answer that. I really didn't know better. I mean, I knew it would be great to have a sawmill, but I didn't realize just how much I would use it in the end. Now, if you don't have trees, well, It's not going to do the guy in the desert a whole lot of good. So no, probably not worth buying a sawmill. But we own 20 acres of forested land, and we need to thin that land out for forest fire protection. Hey, you know, people, you know, today you got a lot of forest fires going on. Now, there's differing opinions on why that is. Mine's probably different than the one you hear in the mainstream media. And if you want to know my opinion, join me on one of my lives and ask me. I'm happy to tell you. But, setting that aside, if you've got trees, logs, the mill, what you find is you do what I did. You mill up a whole bunch of knotty pine paneling, and you make your paneling, and you slap it on the wall, and you make a bunch of live edge stuff. And maybe you use some for some siding, or you make some shelves. And then you start making 2x and 4x, and the sky becomes the limit. So if you're somebody who's likely to do all those things, then yes, a sawmill is a good thing to buy. It's worth buying a sawmill. You're not necessarily going to compete. Let's say you're framing. You're going to frame a cabin in the woods, and you're going to do it with 2x4s or 2x6s, you know, typical studs, 1.5 by 3.5 or 1.5 by 5.5, and you're going to frame the whole thing out with that, and you're thinking, I got some Doug fir or some southern yellow pine or whatever, and I'm going to mill that into dimensional lumber and frame my cabin. Well, guess what? You're not going to beat the big box stores. They're going to make that lumber cheaper than you can. But specialty stuff, that's another story. So, for example, back to that knotty pine. I looked out today. LX25 with 10 bands, the bare basic model like I bought back in 2011, $4,600. Okay? I did find some knotty pine out on the internet. I don't know how good it is, what the guarantees are. I don't even know where it's coming from. But it would have run me about $1,800 to get the knotty pine that I would make my paneling out of for my cabin. Now, that wasn't tongue and groove. So you'd still have to tongue and groove it. If I bought knotty pine that's already tongue and groove and ready to go, I found it at about $3,500 to $4,500, in that range, $3,500 to $4,500. That's milled, dried, planed, and tongue and grooved. So what I had when I put it on the walls of my cabin. So it's cheaper today than it was a dozen years ago. That's interesting. But then we all know lumber prices are kind of low right now. So if you compare that, you know, spend $4,600 on a sawmill or $3,600 on already ready to go pine, you're $1,000 ahead if you don't buy the sawmill. Except, and here's the difference. If you're not going to do anything else, don't buy the sawmill. But if you're going to mill other stuff, then it can definitely pay for itself. Now, again, back to studs. You make studs, you're not competing with the big box store, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. I do. I may not be competing, but I happen to have logs that I have to bring down, logs that it's better for me to bring them down. I'm on a DNR thinning project, so the Department of Natural Resources is paying me to thin the forest around my off-grid cabin, because it's better to thin your forests out and clear all that underbrush and get it all cleaned up than to not do that. Because if you don't and a forest fire comes through, everything's gone. If you do, it'll rip right through naturally, which, by the way, anyway, we'll ask me on a live. So, again, if you're going to use it for posts and beams and live edge stuff, or here's a great example. Go to any store and try to get 1x12s. Try to get 1x20s. I'll bet you can't find 1x20s. But if I've got a log big enough, I can make 1x20s all day long. And how many people have lumber that wide? They don't. Now, some might say, yeah, but if you cut it that wide, it might do this or do that or whatever. Well, sure, it's possible. However, the reality is you can make some wide stuff and then use it for all kinds of things. If you've watched my channel for a while, you know, you've probably seen my bar top or my coffee table. I'm sure you've seen the cabin, you know, the stairs going up into the loft. That I made that, right? All that paneling, I made that. So As far as whether or not a sawmill is worth buying or not, I'm going to tell you, in my opinion, it is, as long as you're the type of person that's going to take that sawmill and do more with it than you probably intended to buy it for. Because you might be able to get that lumber, and I'm pretty sure you probably can, cheaper. Let's take another approach. So let's say you've got 20 or 50 logs. And you're thinking, well, I can mill these logs up and make lumber with them. But if you're not going to do anything else, I'll be honest with you, it's better just to call me out. Call Kevin out. Call any one of these guys out there that are running around with their portable sawmills milling up logs for people, because it's not that expensive. I can go out on a weekend and mill anywhere from 30 to 50 logs, depending on the size of the logs, maybe more, maybe less. I mean, really, really big logs are going to take longer. Small logs, I'm going to crank them out. But, you know, you're talking basically a weekend, maybe a long weekend, and it might cost you $2,000 or $3,000 to have those logs milled up. And now you've got the lumber. All you got to do is dry it, plane it, turn it into tongue and groove, and slap it on the wall, and you're cheaper. You used your logs. It's less expensive than buying a mill. And if you're not going to bring any more logs down and you've got no other projects, you're better off not buying the mill, in my opinion. So it's a really subjective thing. If you're the kind of person that just wants to have a cool tool, well, buy it. Nothing wrong with that. Excuse me. Dusty in the shop. I was cleaning today. Can't run the sawmill right now. I'm waiting on a couple parts. I gotta get that O2 sensor so I can get my sawmill back up and running. And that's the other thing about sawmills. They take maintenance. You don't just buy a sawmill and run it and expect it's never gonna break down. You beat the heck out of them. So they're going to take abuse. You're going to have to do maintenance. You're going to have to learn how to do an alignment. You're going to have to learn to tighten up the drive belt and keep the band tight. And you're either going to have to send your bands off to get them sharpened or figure out how to do it yourself and buy tools to do that. I send mine out. But you're going to run into issues like I have with my mill. And it may not be that easy to troubleshoot it. Although it turns out mine was a lot easier to troubleshoot, and had I done what I always tell people to do, had I done that back in April when I had the problem, especially when my back was really bad and I couldn't be down here working on stuff, the mill would have been fixed in May, folks. And I called up James at Woodmizer and said, hey, James, this is what's going on. And he said, what's your light doing? And I went, well, my light doesn't do anything because it's burned out. And he told me, well, do this and you can check it anyway. Oh, look, you got a bad O2 sensor. I had to replace that O2 sensor and moved right on down the road and kept on milling. In fact, I feel kind of silly over it. But that's part of owning a sawmill. I'm not okay, I've been running a sawmill for a dozen years, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert. I mean, yeah, I got a YouTube channel. Does that make me the guy that knows everything? No, not at all. About the only thing you can say about somebody that makes a YouTube video is that they make videos. It doesn't mean that they're the best in the world at everything they do. Now, there are some out there that are fantastic. I mean, Buck and Billy Ray, that guy he can fall trees. Seems like he knows what he's doing. And I'm not telling you I don't know what I'm doing. I kind of think I do, a little bit. But I'm always learning. And so when I tell you something on my YouTube channels, it doesn't mean it's the only answer. It doesn't even mean it's the best answer. It just means it's my answer. And hey, folks, if you like this video and you're getting anything out of this video, do me a favor. I would love it if you would hit that like button right there, right now. Just click that button right there. No, seriously, I would love it if you would. It really helps the videos out and it helps the channel out. It really helps my channel grow. I do these videos for you. And trust me, YouTube ain't gonna make me rich doing it. You know, you gotta have a lot bigger channel than I do to even think about the possibility of that. So if you'd hit that like button, I'd appreciate it. And if you haven't hit subscribe, hit the subscribe button for me. Again, it's free, why not, right? It helps the channel out. So thank you for that, I appreciate it. It also spreads these videos around. Might be someone else out there wondering if they should buy a sawmill. Well, here you go. Okay, so to recap the first part of this, the LX25 with 10 bands, 4,600 bucks. That's more than it would cost you to buy the knotty pine for your cabin, but if you're gonna mill other stuff and you enjoy it, right, then why not? It's worth it, yes. Is it worth buying a big hydraulic mill? That's probably really the question you wanna know. So if I could step back in time today And if I had the money, because folks, let me tell you something, I'm not wealthy. Folks, I just did a review on a rather inexpensive planer, and I talked about how I've had a Ryobi planer for a dozen years or so. They cost me like $200. Well, why did I have a Ryobi and not like, you know, a Makita or a Rigid or DeWalt or whoever? Well, the truth is, I couldn't afford it. I'm not a wealthy man. I worked hard all my life. That's what I've done. And so I couldn't afford even a $500 planer. But I could afford a $200 or $250. And you know what? It worked. It did the job for me. And so sometimes I'll do a review of something that's a less expensive option for people. Because I get it. I can't afford the most expensive stuff all the time. Now, yeah, I have a $1,200 chainsaw. But that's for my sawmill business. My woodworking stuff isn't for my business for the most part. Some of it, I could use it partly for the business, but mostly it's not. Mostly that's hobby stuff. And I can't afford to spend $1,200, let alone $3,000 or $5,000 on a really good planer. So I buy what I can. Well, when it comes to sawmills, and see, there's a point to this. When it comes to sawmills, I bought the LT10 because I couldn't afford anything. I took the last $3,500 or $3,600, whatever it was we had, the last savings we had no other money. When I bought that sawmill, we were flat broke. We both had jobs, but we had no money in savings when I bought that sawmill. That was it. Now, little did I know that would turn into something far greater down the road. So my first thought on buying a big hydraulic mill, like the LT40 and above, is, to me, the LX25 through the LT35. Those are kind of your hobby mills, hard-working, woodworking kind of guy mill, small time operation, farm sawmills, that kind of stuff. They're not big production mills. Now, the LT35 is obviously on the very upper end of that, and it's bumping into that high production mill category. It's very close in terms of capabilities to the LT40, but there are some pretty big differences that go from that LT35 platform, which is less of a massive production type sawmill platform, to the LT40, which is the beginning of those really serious production mills that are built to last and to take a beating and to go out there and mill all kinds of lumber. So that first group of mills, in my opinion, that's really, any of those are fine. They're all good mills. The LX25 is going to take you a lot of work. And if you get it with the little 7 or 9 horse motor or whatever they offer it with, it's going to be slow. I had a 7 horse on my LT10. I upgraded to a 10 horse. I couldn't believe how fast it was. Imagine what I thought when I went to the 26.5 horse LT40. Yeah. So is it worth buying that mill? Well, I would not say that if you're just going to make, 5,000 board feet of knotty pine for a cabin and then maybe dabble a little bit later, dollars for dollars, I'm not going to tell you to go out and buy an LT40. I think that's crazy. You'd have to have a good amount of money. So let me tell you, you got enough money to throw 40 grand away? Okay, buy it. If you could buy a Ferrari, why not buy an LT70? Fully built out with everything you can have, 50 some odd horse, cat, diesel, whatever, right? But most of us don't have that kind of money. So if you came to me and said, Eric, I want to mill 5,000 board feet of knotty pine and I might dabble a little bit after that, should I buy an LT40? I'd say, no, probably not. Why? Why spend the money? If you can't really afford it, why? If you need the hydraulics, get the LT35. Save you some money, right? I mean, that's what it's all about. If you need the hydraulics, save the money. If you've got a tractor and a strong back, you can get away with an LT15 or less. LT25, if you're like I was a dozen years ago, early 40s, wanting to run a sawmill, I was running a chainsaw mill, I could physically do the work, so I spent the money and I bought the LT10. There's nothing wrong with that. It did what it needed to do. So, is it worth buying the LT40? I would tell you that if your intent is to learn how to mill and then go out and pay for that mill by working for other people, then yes, it definitely can be worth it, as long as you are somebody who's willing to work really hard at what you're doing, because you know, you're not just going to take that sawmill and kind of sort of lackadaisical roll out into the woods and put out 100 or 200 board feet an hour for somebody and pay for your sawmill. Because when I was out there milling, I was shooting for the best production I could produce and the best lumber I could do in that production numbers, and I was typically running 300 board feet an hour all the time, and I ran as high as 500 plus. So the reality is you've got to be a mover and shaker, and if you're a mover and shaker, you're a logger, you know, or you're a woodworker or a marine, or maybe you're just a hard-working everyday Joe. You could do it, but you've got to work hard at it, right? You got to be out there, and sometimes it's backbreaking work. I saw a video, Old Man in the Saw, and he was talking about how his butt was dragging by the end of the day on the last video he produced from that job. Well, yeah, folks, because you're going to walk for miles, unless you got one of the stationary ones, and now you're going up in price again, right? So is it worth buying an LT40 hydraulic? Yep. It can absolutely be, but I wouldn't recommend it for somebody that's going to mill a few thousand board feet and call it quits. Or that's all they really need and they don't see themselves doing it. Why would I do that? I mean, if you need the hydraulics because you're like, to me today I wouldn't buy a manual mill. I loved having one and I learned a ton. If you can start with a manual mill, it's almost the best way to go because you learn a ton, right? You learn things like economy of movement because you're doing all the movement, not the hydraulics. If I could have started back then with the LT40, would I have? No, I think the LT10 was the way to go. I think a lot of times starting with that smaller mill is smart. It saves you a bunch of money, so if you decide you don't like it, you didn't waste a bunch of money. I mean, you got to sell the mill, but what happens if times are slow and you can't sell the mill as easily? So you go out and you spend $4,500 or whatever, and you buy that mill, or maybe spend, you know, $6,500 or whatever an LT15 is. I didn't look it up. Get the one on the trailer maybe, and you mill it for a while, and you're like, yeah, this ain't for me. Well, you're not out $45,000 or more. Finally warmed up in here. Oh, all right. Got a little warmer in here, so it's been cold. We've had a really cool. This week has been really cool. You know, first we had the smoke, then the winds blew it away, and the clouds moved in, and we've had more rain. I think we've had more rain this August than we've had in I don't know how long. Enough blabbering on. I've gone on plenty long now. Thanks for watching, folks. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, hit that like button if you did. Maybe share it out with your friends. I hope that helps you out in deciding whether to buy a sawmill or not, whether it's worth it or not. Was it worth it for me? Absolutely. I guess I hadn't answered that earlier maybe, but it was for me. So there you have it. Anyway, folks, thanks for watching. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to drop another video right here for you to watch. So check that one out for me. And got more coming. Thanks for watching. Bill Jarhead out.